Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. There are no spoilers this week, so no matter what you have read or not seen, feel free to watch on. This week I want to talk about the act of claiming texts from their authors, why we might feel the need to do this and how we might go about it. So during lockdown I have been reading at my fairly regular, fairly slow rate. I'm not a very fast reader. But a lot of my reading material during lockdown has been quite heavy. So I've read The Mirror and the Light, which is Hilary Mantel's third Thomas Cromwell book. I read War and Peace. That's not a light read in any sense of the word. I've read some Hardy, as well as reading The Order Lord and Rennie Edo Lodge that I talked about last week, and a whole lot of other stuff. And it hasn't been like particularly uplifting reading, I wouldn't say. So in search of some levity, I have also been listening to a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which I will talk about later in this video. So alongside listening to Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which is an exploration of the Harry Potter books as sacred texts and looking at ways that we can read them as sacred texts, I have also been listening to the Harry Potter series. So these are books that I sort of grew up with. I don't have a particularly strong emotional connection to them personally, but they are very much part of the generation that I grew up in. So they live there. And it is Harry Potter that sort of brings me to the catalyst for making this video, and I'm sure a few of you now will know in what direction I'm going. So to put us all in the picture, I'm going to give a bit of background. 2 weeks ago, Marnie Sommer, Virginia Kamovar and Therese Maun, I hope I'm pronouncing those names properly, they wrote a piece for Devex titled Opinion, Creating a More Equal Post-COVID-19 World for People Who Menstruate. I will link the article below. It's a really interesting and useful and thoughtful piece, I think. It starts, COVID-19 highlights the vulnerable amongst us across the globe. And it goes on to say, an estimated 1.8 billion girls, women and gender non-binary persons menstruate, and this has not stopped because of the pandemic. They still require menstrual materials, safe access to toilets, soap, water and private spaces in the face of lockdown living conditions that have eliminated privacy for many populations. The article then goes on to call for investment, and it has a list of reasons to invest in mental health and hygiene. It's really worth having a look at. J.K. Rowling, however, took umbrage, and I am purposefully using the word umbrage, with the title of this article. And she tweeted the link to the article and she commented, "People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Woman, wimpened, woomad." The vast majority of responses to Rowling's comments called her out on her erasure of trans and non-binary people, and I'd like to read you a few of those responses. @Clue tweeted, "Hi J.K. Rowling, using non-gendered language is about moving beyond the idea that woman equals uterus. Feminists were once mocked for wanting to change sexist language, but it's now common to say firefighter instead of fireman." Royally Queer tweeted, "That's interesting because I have endometriosis and an IUD in place to treat it, and therefore I no longer menstruate. I haven't had a menstrual cycle since early high school and I'm 21. I guess I'm not a woman anymore." And Scotty GB tweeted, "Please talk to some queer people, please." To which Rowling responded, "One of my best mates just called me self-described butch lesbian." I'm not going to read the rest of the tweet because it just becomes really sweary, but this kind of like virtue signaling, like, well, I can't be transphobic because I've got a lesbian friend, I think really reeks of the kind of I'm not racist, I have a black friend rhetoric, which is just so impulsively defensive and outwardly damaging. And you'd think someone as smart as Rowling would be aware of how that's going to read in the current climate. However, we shouldn't be that surprised by Rowling's stance, and also the fact that once called out on this stance, she just doubles down, because she actually has a history of transphobia. Two examples that are raised in an article by Advocate, which I will also link below, include an occasion when she misgendered a trans woman just 2 weeks ago, and when she defended Maya Forstater, I think that's her name, who is a woman who was fired for her anti-trans rhetoric on social media, and Rowling came out in defense of her. So First of all, and this is probably clear from the way that I'm speaking, I stand with everyone calling Rowling out on this language. The article actually uses the term women. It says girls, women, and gender non-binary people. So there's no question of it erasing the idea of woman. So I think that J.K. Rowling's attack on this article is not just transphobic, but it's really unnecessarily nasty. I'll put my hands up and say that I haven't read her subsequent response. She wrote, I guess, what is an open letter to sort of follow up on these events. I have read an article from Mermaids addressing the things that she talks about her in her article, which I will link below as well. But yesterday I did wake up to this New York Times headline. Trump administration erases transgender civil rights protections in healthcare. A rule finalized on Friday by the Department of Health and Human Services means that the federal government no longer recognizes gender identity as an avenue for sex discrimination in healthcare. This announcement came out in the middle of Pride Month on the 4-year anniversary of the massacre at gay nightclub Pulse in Orlando. This is so politically charged and so cruel and so pointed. Rowling says she isn't transphobic. She just basically argues that she is pro-women, but cis women, I think, has become pretty clear. And she's been called a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist, I think quite rightly. But I just think that in a world where the US government is casually stripping rights from human beings, that this is not really a murky issue. This is not an issue of opinion. This is a matter of life or death. And I suppose I also don't need to point out that stripping rights in health organisations in the middle of a global pandemic is particularly evil. Now look, Harry Potter has flaws, and it's not just because it's written by a transphobic woman. I actually think the way that she writes girls is really sexist and often strays into quite damaging stereotypes, which is ironic given how feminist she seems to think she is. She also has this rather nasty habit of equating fat with bad. So if you look at characters like Dudley or Aunt Marge, these are characters whose fatness is used as a way to describe them to make them seem nasty and unpleasant. So these are problems, and I have to say that as a fat woman, I can see past those issues to the more essential human narratives, because I think that there are really true, honest, good, inclusive narratives in these texts. So when this happened with J.K. Rowling and she made these statements about trans people, I think there was a great mourning by many, many people who feel that they had lost Harry Potter. This is something that has happened quite a lot in recent history, particularly with the Me Too movement, where there is a sort of heartbreak and loss at the idea of losing art made by people who are sexual abusers, who are transphobic, who are just seem to be on the wrong side of inclusivity. But the thing is that art does get into our hearts, and it is worth mourning. There's nothing wrong with mourning a piece of art that you love, that you feel has been taken away from you. And Harry Potter is so important to so many people, and it actually has actively been a resource of lessons of inclusion and acceptance. So it's not just important to human beings. I think it's actually been actively important for many LGBT plus people. So her attack is particularly heartbreaking. But some people had a different response, and it's this response that I want to jump off from to talk about claiming texts. The Daily Prophet posted a guide to cancelling JKR while keeping Harry Potter. HP Sacred Text, which is the Twitter handle of the podcast that I will speak about in a moment, said, "These books belong to us. We love and stand with our trans listeners and are sorry that Rowling keeps disappointing us. We see you and you are perfect." And Daniel Radcliffe wrote a beautiful response along similar lines for the Trevor Project. And actually since then, many other cast members of Harry Potter films have also come out in defense of a kind of keep the text, lose the author rhetoric. Obviously, the first place to go if you want to talk about divorcing art and artist is Roland Barthes. In 1967, he wrote an essay called The Death of the Author. The essay is not that long, and I will link a translation below, but it's very easy to find as well. But I'm just going to top and tail it because I think that what we're talking about is really encapsulated in his introduction and his conclusion. So at the beginning, he says, in his story Sarracine, Balzac, speaking of a castrato disguised as a woman, writes this sentence: "It was woman, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring, and her delicious delicacy of feeling." Who is speaking in this way? Is it the story's hero, concerned to ignore the castrato concealed beneath the woman? Is it the man, Balzac, endowed by his personal experience with a philosophy of woman? Is it the author, Balzac, professing certain literary ideas of femininity? Is it universal wisdom or romantic psychology? It will always be impossible to know, for the good reason that all writing is itself this special voice, consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. And he ends this essay by writing that the source of the text, its voice, is not to be located, and yet it is perfectly read. This is because the true locus of writing is reading. So the whole idea that the reader is greater than the writer liberates texts and encourages us to use texts and interpret them and to look closely at the text to see what they are really saying. When I'm teaching, I always advise my students that authorial intention is really, really murky. Even if you have an example of an author telling you what their text is about, they're engaged with narrative where an idea of fact and truth is very, very complicated. Furthermore, texts take from one another. This mutability of narrative enables creation. I always tell my students to focus on their experience as reader. Of course, you have to back up your arguments. You have to find evidence that speaks to what you're trying to discuss. But the text is an experience that you have with the text. This is basically what I did with The Secret Garden, and I will link to that video as well. It was a reading of a text based on evidence that I had found in the text, which I am absolutely certain was not the author's intention. This is also an idea that has come up for me a lot because I specialised in modernism. And modernism came out of very elite, exclusive groups that were quite sexist, that were very anti-Semitic. For example, we have people like Ezra Pound, who was an outspoken fascist. However, my love of modernism, even of some of Ezra Pound's early texts, is so direct, so profound. Those texts are so brilliant and they are so important in the history of literature and in our understanding of early 20th century consciousness, that to dismiss them because of those things would be a tragedy. I mean, particularly for me, losing T.S. Eliot would be just indescribable. So in the past, I have looked to Barthes and this death of the author idea to justify a kind of passive dismissal of author. So because Barthes says that reading is the locus of writing, that kind of empowered me to say I don't need to deal with the writers right now. I can just deal with the text as being an experience that I am having with a piece of art. It seems to me that this passive dismissal is not enough. There is now a sense that we need to actively claim texts from their authors. We need to actively claim Harry Potter from J.K. Rowling. So listen again to these two quotations I want to read. First, from The Death of the Author, that the source of the text, its voice, is not to be located, and yet it is perfectly read. This is because the true locus of writing is reading. And the beginning of this tweet from H.P.'s Sacred Text, which says, "These books belong to us." So this is not to say that the separation of text and author is easy. It can be extremely complex. I mean, what about texts where authors are integrated into their texts? What about someone like Woody Allen? And I don't want to talk now about which side of that argument I'm on, but he is certainly someone who is in this Me Too debate. He is in his texts, but his texts, his films, are in the fabric of cinema and are extremely influential. The New York that he filmed in the 70s is also the New York that we see now in modern cinema. I mean, how do you deal with texts where the author is part of them? That's a question that still I don't have an answer for. I think actually television and film is particularly difficult because it's so attached to actors. When we watch an actor, we experience their interpretation of a narrative, and capitalism ties stars really closely to text because that's how you sell them. I mean, for example, it is not uncommon to hear a phrase like the 1999 Kevin Spacey film American Beauty. That is a way of describing the film that is posed to draw you in, or was. The idea of art versus artist is also not new. But what struck me in this moment with J.K. Rowling and with these people trying to claim the text back from her is that because of the status of Harry Potter, because people love it so much, it may give us the momentum to take a step forward towards claiming texts where we need to. I think the whole idea of cancel culture, of just like calling someone out and saying that they're cancelled, is really lazy because it doesn't engage with the texts themselves, nor does it hold the artists to account. We need to be doing the work. We need to claim the art that is important and empowering and speaks to our hearts. And we need to hold the artists to account for what they say, for what they put into the world, for the way that they hurt people. This brings me to my final point, and as I promised, I would like to talk for just a moment about this podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Now, what I like about this so much is that it models precisely this action that I'm talking about claiming texts and experiencing them as a reader. The podcast deals with reader, not writer. I could count on one hand the number of times I've heard them mention Rowling's name. I think it really models ways of looking at and interpreting and understanding text, and it draws that parallel between text and reader so that that is the relationship that is brought out and felt to be important. It is also a really joyous, inclusive, progressive space to be in this time of real hatred and heartbreak and discrimination. I think that we need spaces that just encourage us to love things and to understand them and to look at human beings as the wonderful creatures that we are. That's all I have to say this week. Thank you for watching. If you want to share, please do spread the word, get people to talk to me. You can subscribe down here. Do that now, subscribe. And if you want to engage with me elsewhere, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Both places my handle is @StellaOtwell. And I will be back next week with something else.